All right, so right now we're going to go ahead and discuss macromolecules. The essential question that we are looking to answer today is what are the functions of the four macromolecules in your body? So hopefully what you'll start to see is that all of those different molecular things that we talked about in regards to water and how its structure directly affects its function and makes it important for life, you could now be able to apply in this situation when we start to discuss macromolecules, so things other than water that living organisms need to be considered alive. So first off, how many valence electrons does carbon have? Well, the answer to this is 4. And so really what that means is carbon can bind itself to 4 other atoms. And so it has the ability to form millions of different structures of basically indefinite length. And so life on planet Earth has used carbon as the backbone to all of the structures that it needs to maintain life and to display all those properties of living things. And so since almost everything on planet Earth is made up of this carbon backbone, there's an entire branch of chemistry dedicated to it that we refer to as organic chemistry. And so the word organic, at least in science, comes down to meaning anything that is carbon containing. So this leads us to macromolecules, and remember that macromolecules are giant molecules. And so the prefix macro actually means enormous or large. And so we're looking at large, giant molecules. There are 4 macromolecules that you will need to be aware of and able to describe. The first is carbohydrates, then lipids, then proteins, and finally nucleic acids. And so looking up the first 3, you've probably seen those in regards to nutrition, and hopefully the 4th is also familiar to you because of DNA. So, what does a macromolecule mean? Well, macromolecules are so large because they have different components to them. And so the first component is something called a monomer. And a monomer is a small unit that is repeated in a macromolecule through the process of polymerization, because then that monomer, once it's polymerized or added multiple links to it, forms a polymer. So a monomer is the base unit, and we string a bunch of monomers together, and that makes a polymer. So we can also look at it like this, where the monomer is the engine portion of the train, and the polymer is the engine portion plus all the other portions on the train. So you do need to put into your notes the common functional groups, and so go ahead and take a second and set up this data table so that it looks exactly like what is here, and we are going to just very quickly talk about each of these different components that allow these different carbon macromolecules to be created. So first we have a hydroxyl functional group, which is the OH, and you can see the example there is glucose with the different hydroxyls on it. We also have carboxyl groups, and so that's the hydrogen, oxygen, oxygen, carbon, and if you look, there's an amino acid with a carboxyl on it. We have the amine or amino groups, which is nitrogen and 2 hydrogens, and so you can see again in the amino acid example. And finally, we have phosphate functional groups, which you can see there on the amino acid. And so really, it's just remembering these different portions of the formulas and understanding that they go into and give identity to each of the different macromolecules that we are going to be discussing. So let's go ahead and dive right into our discussion on macromolecules. So the overview of the first macromolecule, carbohydrates, it is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, so we call it a CHO molecule. Its monomer is glucose, or more specifically, a monosaccharide. Living things are going to use carbohydrates for energy, quick energy, the immediate energy of life. And so some examples of different foods that you can find carbohydrates in, it's pretty limitless, but big ones would be pasta and bread. You do need to know the atomic structure of glucose, and so if you want to take a minute and copy this down, you can see it. But you can see that glucose has the chemical formula of C6H12O6, and if you count each of the atoms here in the structural formula, you will see that it all adds right up to that. So single sugars, as mentioned before, are referred to as monosaccharides, and then monosaccharides are linked together to form polysaccharides. So monosaccharides are the monomer, and polysaccharides are the polymer, and so you can see how it just keeps repeating. That glucose molecule or that monosaccharide molecule just keeps getting added together and repeated to create that polysaccharide. Our second macromolecule are lipids. Now please notice that lipids are also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but in this case lipids are not carbohydrates, of course. They are fats, oils, and waxes. Their monomer is glycerol and fatty acids. They don't follow the rules exactly like the other three macromolecules do, but for our purposes, the monomer is glycerol and a fatty acid. Lipids are not soluble in water, and so that's referred to as being hydrophobic or water-fearing. So if you've ever mixed oil and vinegar together, the oil sits on top of the vinegar. Same thing happens with water. Lipids' main job is to store energy for long-term use. They are also used in building cell membranes, and there's some structural things. Examples of lipids in the body would be your body fat. So any fat that's on your body is a lipid. Butter, olive oil, beeswax for candles is also an example of lipids. So if we look, here's the structure of a triglyceride, and so you can see that there's the glycerol portion, which is boxed in red, and then there's the fatty acid portion, which is boxed in blue. And so you do need to put one of these in your notes. So if you would very quickly copy that structure into your notes so that you have it. Feel free to pause this video if you need more time. So when we're looking at food as a source of energy for our bodies, so food as fuel, your body first burns carbohydrates for energy. If it runs out of carbs and there aren't any more carbs available, then your body turns to lipids and starts to use fat for energy. The only time your body will use protein for energy is as a very last resort, and it doesn't have anything else to use for energy. So please remember that protein is not a source of energy. Our sources of energy are carbohydrates and lipids. So, fats can be saturated or unsaturated. Which do you think is healthier? So, unsaturated fats, which are fats that are liquids at room temperature, are actually healthier to eat. So, saturated means that the carbon atoms are full of hydrogen already, and unsaturated means that there are double bonds between carbon atoms and less hydrogen. And the fact that there's those less hydrogen on the bonds already there makes it a healthier fat for you to consume rather than if it's all saturated and the carbon is already full. And this really just has to do with what your body does is it breaks down the fats for energy. Our third macromolecule is proteins. And so our first two were carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And so just like lipids and carbohydrates, proteins also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but proteins now are also going to add nitrogen. And so proteins are a CHON molecule. So we've had CHO, now we're on CHON. The monomer is amino acids, and there are 20 amino acids that can join together to form all the different types of proteins. Proteins form bones and muscles. They control chemical reactions in our bodies. And examples of places we can get lots of protein in our diet would be meat, beans, and eggs. So here's the structure of the amino acid. You need to make sure that you can recognize this structure in your notes, and you can see, so copy this into your notes, and you can see that there's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen in this molecule. The thing that makes amino acids special is the pink there that's referred to as the R group. And so every amino acid has the top portion of this diagram. The R group is what differentiates them from each other, and that R group is going to be a variety of different elements and chemicals. And so please know that the top part is always the same. The R group is going to be different between amino acids. The big thing that you have to remember about proteins is it's not just what the order of amino acids in that determines the protein. In fact, the structure of the protein has to be exact for it to function properly. And so we have 4 different levels of structure when we're talking about proteins. We have the primary structure, which really is just a chain of amino acids stuck together. From that primary structure, we go to the secondary structure, where there's a 2-dimensional folding and creation of the molecule. Then we go to the tertiary structure, where the entirety of the molecule folds over on itself and creates a 3-dimensional structure. And then some proteins even go on to have a quaternary structure, and this is where multiple proteins work together and become subunits for the entirety of the protein, which is that quaternary or 4th level structure. Our final amino acid, our final molecule, is our nucleic acids, and nucleic acids are CHOMP molecules. Their monomer is a nucleotide, and the nucleotide has 3 parts: a sugar, a base, and a phosphate group. The function, sole function, is to store genetic information that can be transcribed and turned into a protein. And examples of nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. So here is the formula or the chemical structure for a nucleotide. So you can see that there's the phosphate group with the sugar and the base. So go ahead, if you need to pause this video, pause it, but get this copied into your notes so that you are able to identify it. So go ahead, take a minute, summarize your notes, and discuss everything that you learned about macromolecules and how they are important for your body.